All right, that was Wozny Lambre, Big Woz from Woke Bros, many other places. I am now joined by the man who I sincerely hope will be the next congressman representing San Francisco, Shahid Buttar.
Right on. Thanks for having me. Great to be with you. Shahid is how you say it, but yeah, so
Sorry,
excited.
Shahid, my mistake. Yes.
Oh, it's all good. No worries. If I had a nickel for every time somebody did that, I'd be as wealthy as Nancy Pelosi. But
that's a good line. Uh, yeah, which I should really know because I've been supporting you for quite some time. Actually, I had. In fact, back in the beginning of February, there was a campaign commercial for you on YouTube that has that I had a very brief speaking line in,
I
as
remember
well
that.
as as
Uh-huh.
well as our friend Michael Brooks, and in fact, on the day that Bernie Sanders ended his 2020 campaign, or I think he suspended initially. And so with great sadness, I ended my my monthly recurring donation to the Sanders campaign, and I set one up for you the same day.
Thank you so
Um,
much for your support. I remember that day very vividly because I was shedding literal tears. I saw my own future shift in that moment because I signed up to be one of his lieutenants and breathe into being this brighter future. And I'm down for the alternative. I mean, what I'm now auditioning for is the opportunity to try to stave off the worst parts of a fascist future. And I'm here for that. As a Muslim immigrant, I've spent plenty of time resisting. The opportunity to build something brighter with Bernie was something that drew me into the race. The need to fight Trump is frankly what keeps me in it. That when Bernie suspended his campaign, I felt the closest analog I have to this is the moment when Obi-Wan Kenobi on the Millennium Falcon feels the destruction of Alderaan, and I felt millions of voices in the indefinite future crying out at once. I mean, it pains me to even think about now, but so much turned this spring in that moment.
yeah, no question about it. And since we're talking about stopping the worst of Trump, and obviously it's a particularly bad moment right now. Because as we're speaking, I believe that it was supposed to be at 5, right? So a few minutes ago, possibly, unless the press conference is starting late, I believe Trump is right now announcing the appointment of
Right.
Amy Coney Barrett
Right.
to the Supreme Court. And it doesn't, however much it might be possible for, if Chuck Schumer was really going to use every procedural trick possible to try to delay it, I don't know if that would work or not, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen. So it looks like there is going to be a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and of course, we're about to have an election where and it's very difficult, right? Because so many liberals have cried wolf about this stuff in so many ways, but the signals that are being sent right now are extremely disturbing, right? So literally, Trump just said a couple days ago, he was asked if he would peacefully leave power if Biden was elected, and he said, "We'll see." So
Foreshadowing.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, right. So it does. So I think that that the importance of stopping Trump from getting that second term if possible, and everything everything that goes with that, right? I think something the left often doesn't have its eye on nearly enough is the National Labor Relations Board appointees. That Trump is going to consistently appoint people whose mission in life is to stamp out what's left of organized labor
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, right? So I do actually think that's important, and so because I do live in a swing state, I'll hold my nose and do what I have to do electorally to help make that happen.
As I
Uh,
would if I lived in a swing state.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
But because you live in California, in fact, not only, of course, you're not in that position, but also because California's election laws are unusual. So the top 2 vote getters in the primary go on the general election ballot, even if they're both Democrats, which means that people in your district, when it comes to the congressional race, don't have to make that kind of choice. Their choices are Nancy Pelosi and you, which would be a wonderful position to be in, frankly, electorally, that you can vote for the things that you care about without worrying about electing a Republican. So obviously that's very exciting. And I guess the biggest thing I want to talk to you about today, and I know that there are 1,000 answers to this question, but let's just start out with the obvious. Why is it so important that, if at all possible, Nancy Pelosi is replaced with you?
Succinctly, because Nancy Pelosi has done everything she can from a policy perspective to pave the road of the right wing and this aspiring fascist tyrant of a president. The demonstrations of so-called resistance, using air quotes here, resistance to Trump, have been entirely theatrical, ripping a speech, clapping sideways, which she actually said was not ironic at all, but it meant sincerely, pointing sternly across the table, putting on her sunglasses while wearing a red coat. It's not unlike the fawning over Kamala Harris's Timberlands when she gets off the plane. It's like the subversion of Washington by Hollywood and the subversion of policy by celebrity. And I'm not interested in celebrity. I'm very interested in policy. I've spent 20 years fighting to first help make marriage equality a federal right. I've been fighting to restrain the surveillance state. I've fought against CIA torture. I've worked against police profiling in communities across the country. And on all of those different issues, Nancy Pelosi was on the other side.
So you mentioned marriage equality, which is a good reminder, because the video producer for the show, Forrest, comes from New Paltz.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah.
Right on. What a small world.
Yeah. And so when I told him, that I'd be interviewing you, he said, oh yeah, back when, our
Jason
Green
West.
Party mayor in New Paltz was performing same-sex weddings, and signing off on that. And of course it was legally challenged. Shahid came to New Paltz, to work for him legally. So I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but I think that's a very cool thing about your history. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, it's a fun story, actually. So Jason West is the figure you're describing. He was Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2004, elected as the mayor of New Paltz, New York. And I met him at a conference at American University in Washington, D.C. It was the National Conference on Organized Resistance, so an anarchist conference in 2004. And we were each there speaking as artist activists. I organize spoken word artists and hip hop artists. I've been doing that for 20 years. So there's collectives in 3 different cities that I help pull together that are all still active. Some of the work of which I'm proudest, actually, is the people coming out of those communities. So I was talking on the panel about that. Jason, before becoming the mayor of his town, worked with Bread and Puppet. It's a group in the Northeast that builds giant street puppets for street actions, ways to illustrate in our resistance some of the themes that we might be trying to raise in policy and in our communities. And so he was talking about visual art in the street. I was talking about performance art in the street. We bonded on the panel. We had a chat, as one does with other panelists after the thing, and we traded cards. And he mentioned that he had some constituents who basically were working artists who'd relocated from New York City to the Hudson Valley. Some of them were later in life, people who had effectively survived the AIDS Holocaust of the 80s. And these were people, in some cases, who had relationships that they were concerned, especially about being able to be visited in the hospital by their partners who wouldn't have access to visit them without the recognition that comes with marriage. And at the time, frankly, no one was talking about it. Gavin Newsom, now the governor of California, at the time the mayor of San Francisco, it was a few months after that he had took the bold step. He was the first mayor in the country to solemnize same-sex weddings. And Jason moved a few weeks later, and I was very proud to work on that case. For me, it was particularly poignant for maybe 2 reasons. One, as a Muslim raised in the Midwest, the opportunity to stand for the rights of my gay neighbors, frankly, before many of my gay neighbors were standing for those rights. I mean, there weren't Democrats in the country standing up for it. I mean, I was ahead of most Democrats, and people look back now and they take it for granted. An entire generation, frankly, takes that right for granted, but we fought for it. And Democrats were not there. And so one was just sort of I took a lot of shots in the Muslim community for standing with gay people. And the point was, civil rights are intersectional. And intersectionality is a principle that I think many people have come to understand in the years since. I had an opportunity to experience it in praxis, let's say. And then that second point was just how slow the careerists were to embrace rights. And this is always the case. Nancy Pelosi, to her credit, did show up to try to challenge the federal DOMA legislation, but she basically regarded marriage equality as a states' rights issue for years until, frankly, effectively after the fact, the Obergefell decision, I think was in I'm going to get my dates confused. I think it was 2013, maybe 2014.
I think 2014.
That sounds right. And I think Pelosi came to embrace marriage equality at the federal level, not until like 2012, maybe 2011, but very late. And the point here is that the incumbents, the generation of incumbents that preceded us have always put their careers before our communities. And the future can't take that. There's too much at risk. The skies were blood red at high noon here in San Francisco a few weeks ago. And it just is a very vivid illustration of the policy failures of the preceding paradigm and the need, frankly, for us to embrace some real change. And that era of my history is one I don't have a chance often to reflect upon. So thanks for bringing it up. I wish, frankly, that more people in San Francisco realized it. I talk about it, but it's interesting to me that the LGBTQ, the progressive LGBTQ club in San Francisco endorsed Pelosi, which I just, I don't even know what to say about that. It's called the Harvey Milk LGBTQ Democratic Club, and it endorsed a person who funded Trump's concentration camps. And I fought for marriage equality 10 years before she did. And you look at that kind of phenomenon of organized groups voting against their own interests, and it is disappointing. Let's say that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Liberals love to talk about, rural Republicans in Kansas, voting against their own interests, but then they act like this. So I guess the natural transition there, right? Is we're talking about your work on marriage equality, but for a long time after that, right? You're very focused on civil liberties issues.
Yeah. So for me, that really started around 2008. Just to fill in the gap in between, when I met Jason and did that work, I was actually in private practice at a San Francisco law firm in the firm's DC office. And the other case, the one that the firm had given me when I got there before we pulled in Jason's representation, I was representing two members of the House, Chris Shays and Marty Meehan. They were the bipartisan co-sponsors of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2003, BICRA. This was the last time Congress tried to take corporate soft money out of elections. Yeah. And we represented them before the Federal Election Commission. And we won that case before the DC Circuit, right at the same time that we lost the New Paltz cases in the New York State courts. And it's interesting, the subsequent history of both of those cases goes in opposite directions. We lost the battle in New Paltz around marriage equality, but then won the war, first in 2011 when the state legislature gave marriage equality to residents of New York State, and then in the Obergefell decision a few years later. In the campaign finance arena, we won the battle before the DC Circuit in 2006, but then the Supreme Court in the Citizens United decision 5 years later laid waste to that era of my career. So I've won a battle in the courts and lost the broader war. I've lost a battle in the courts and won the broader war. One of the things I take away from that, and it's particularly poignant given the event transpiring as we speak, I'm having another of those moments where I feel millions of people crying out. The Supreme Court, anything that we gain in the courts is ephemeral. And frankly, in Congress, we can't really trust gains either, because especially with the courts arrayed against us, they will whittle back congressional initiatives that do meet the needs of we the American people. It's why the court is so crucial, because it can become a crucial limit on our democracy in a way that could constrain and has already long constrained our ability to meet our needs. And I'm very concerned about all of it.
Yeah. So I guess, one way, because I think that a lot of people do know this stuff, at least on the left, but I think a lot of people, don't, or might lose sight of just how deep, right, the divide is, on some of these issues between somebody like you and a corporate centrist like Pelosi. And certainly, I think it speaks to the importance of this race, right? So we're starting to to talk about civil liberties and your work on those issues. And Nancy Pelosi has been in Congress for a very long time. Actually, when did she start?
1987. And if I can, just to
Yeah,
touch this, because I realize I missed at least one
yeah,
part of the answer I meant
yeah.
to share before. In that time that she's been in Congress since 87, before she became the speaker, she was the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. This is the committee that signed off, just like Dianne Feinstein's committee on the Senate side, the Senate Intelligence Committee. Those are the two committees that oversee the national security agencies, the NSA, the CIA. They oversee everything from drone strikes to torture to mass surveillance. These are very much the issues that I spent the last 10 years grappling with. And as I've been fighting the Obama administration from the left, and then the Trump administration, and before that, the Bush administration, throughout that time, I've seen Nancy Pelosi carrying the Bush administration's water, just like the Obama administration later did. And frankly, I see this demonstrated. It's really interesting at this point in time when, on the one hand, Nancy Pelosi, impeached Donald Trump a year ago, and about 6 months ago, revived expired surveillance powers from the dead to then hand him and expand his ability to suppress domestic dissent. And the inconsistency of even the attempts theatrically to stand for civil liberties in the face of an ongoing onslaught on our rights. And just to be clear, it's not just mass surveillance that could become a key lever of thought police. It's not just torture with impunity. It's not just mass incarceration. It's not just arbitrary police violence, deadly, lethal police violence with impunity. It's not just executive secrecy to hide all these things from public view. It's not just coups abroad, likely in 3 different countries in Latin America alone in the last 2 years. It's not just an ecocide across the Amazon, at the same time that we're having our own domestic catastrophes driven by this preventable climate crisis. It's all of those things, plus a pandemic. I mean, it boggles the mind how deep and multifaceted the failure is. And I see that in the human rights and civil liberties arena, particularly a bipartisan offense. I am a socialist. I come to these issues very much from the left. And as an immigrant raised in the Midwest, I understand how deeply many conservatives care about these issues. These are, in fact, bipartisan commitments. Our constitutional commitments transcend party lines, which is why I find it especially offensive that the leadership of both corporate political parties have aligned themselves with the executive branch against we the people of the United States. And I see in our race a referendum as to what kind of government do we want? Do we want it to be a government for, of, and by the people, with our elected representatives representing we the people? Or do we want a government for, of, and by corporations, as we have had? And we've seen how that worked out for us. And I just would implore anyone in San Francisco who is concerned about the future to lean into the opportunity to change it. If we find ourselves fearful of change because it's happening too quickly in our times, I think of FDR here. The only thing we have to fear here is fear itself, because that's what constrains us from making the bold decisions we need to meet the future.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, as you say, the fact that where you are in California, you've seen such apocalyptic consequences of climate change recently, really goes to the point, because the difference, certainly on that issue, right? I mean, the difference between incrementalism and outright denial is largely aesthetic.
That's right. Aesthetic is a great way to put it. And I often say that climate delay is arguably worse than climate denial from a moral culpability standpoint, because as much as I'm not going to excuse the ignorance of climate denialists or deniers, but climate delayers like Nancy Pelosi, who acknowledge the science and yet still refuse to do anything about it, who sit on their hands in the face of species-threatening calamities. And, I'm glad to see the House pass a measure recently to expand renewable energy, but the scale of the commitments pale relative to the scale of the need. And we need actual action. And Nancy Pelosi, the most important thing she did in this congressional session with respect to the climate disaster is hamstring the new committee on the climate crisis. She denied it investigative authority, and she denied it policymaking authority. And that's exactly what we need, is empowered committees to be developing the very broad-ranging, transformative legislation we need to meet this need of the coming, and the fact, not just the coming, but at hand crisis. One intersection, just to connect some dots, I'm not sure if we did talk about it. It's certainly been on my mind a lot. The eugenics at the concentration camps, the Trump Pelosi concentration camps. There's a connection here with the climate crisis. A lot of people don't realize that the migrants coming to our southern border in particular, the ones from Central America, are fleeing a drought. It is climate disaster that is driving the migration crisis that is already creating these human rights calamities in the United States. And that's only going to get worse. The water wars are going to displace potentially billions of people. The waves of migration we are seeing now are nothing, because large parts of the planet might actually become uninhabitable. And those people are going to need to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And
yeah, right. And
yeah,
of
deep
course,
stuff happening that we have to be ready
climate
for.
change, drove water shortages that helped start the civil war in Syria, which caused a refugee, like a large wave of refugees there. And as you say, it could be just a very small taste, right? Of what's coming up. But earlier you referred to the kind of sweeping legislative solutions that we do need on climate change. And this is something that's really worth underlining. Somebody reminds me in chat of Nancy Pelosi's description of the Green New Deal as I believe her phrase was the Green Dream or whatever.
The Green New Dream or whatever. Nobody knows what's in it, but they're still for it, right? That was her line. And this is the same figure who talks about the Squad as a handful of votes. The same figure who, recommits blithely to capitalism, even as entire generations are trying to shrug off its yoke. It's the same figure who, remains beholden to effectively every corporate interest you could fathom, certainly the fossil fuel and energy industries before the climate justice community. And, this is someone who I think the challenge I have as a constituent of Nancy Pelosi's, who is also a professional advocate, is that I see up close in slow motion a lot of what she does, and I pay too much attention to be fooled by the theater of it. And I recognize the disparity between the rhetoric and the reality. And her rhetoric's great if she was the figure that she's constructed to be by media sources. I'd be all for her. But at the same time that she claims to be fighting this criminal president, she's paving his road, and that is simply unacceptable. No one's career, no party's interests, nothing is worth more than the truth there. We need people in these seats in Congress. And I certainly hope that Trump is not the president in the next term, and I will do everything I can as a citizen. I'll be in the street to try to keep that from happening. And if he, through whatever machinations, stays in the White House, we need people in Congress who will actually stand up to him. And the most powerful thing we as a people could do is to make sure that Nancy Pelosi is not there to hold the gavel in the next session. I would be very eager to vote for Barbara Lee to serve as the next Speaker of the House. She's done all the things, frankly, that Nancy Pelosi tries to claim credit for doing without having done when it mattered. And Barbara Lee shows up when it matters. She's the person who will stand against the executive branch. She's the one who will try to stop an illegal war. She'll try to stop a surveillance scheme. She'll stand up for a marginalized community. She's done it for decades. And that's the kind of figure that we need leading the Democratic Party at a time like this. And it's not going to happen as long as Nancy Pelosi remains in the House. And I'm eager, as the first Democrat in 30 years, to face her in a November election, to do my small part in defending our democracy.
Yeah, so you talked about stopping illegal wars, and there is a dot I wanted to connect there to something you said earlier, because I think a phrase that you used that I could imagine somebody watching or listening to this and saying, well, hold on, right? What do you mean there? Was the Trump Pelosi concentration camps?
Yes.
But of course, that's literally true, right? I mean, the Democrats control the House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House, and that means that they control the purse strings that fund things like concentration camps, or for that matter, you want to talk about illegal wars that at the very time that of course conservative media thought that she was a progressive devil, right? But that during the Bush era, right, anytime, right, Pelosi and the Democrats could have cut off funding to the war, and they didn't, right? Anytime, right now, they could cut off funding to ICE and the concentration camps, and they don't do it.
Or the DHS goon squads, or the NSA surveillance apparatus, or the CIA torture, drone strike, assassination, national security crisis creation machine. There's any number of things that we do that are ham-fisted, belligerent, ignorant, frankly, stupid wastes of resources that kill Americans at the end of the day.